NATO sends a warning to Moscow.
President Putin has made a big mistake.
Russia's attack on Ukraine dominates the latest talks in Brussels. But will the world's largest military alliance find a way to stop the fighting? I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's newsmaker is the NATO summit. NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg has called it the most serious security crisis in a generation. Since Russia launched its assault on Ukraine, thousands have been killed, millions forced to flee, in what some describe as the fastest growing humanitarian crisis since the Second World War. On Thursday, leaders from NATO, the EU, and the G7 gathered in Brussels for back-to-back emergency meetings. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky said the summit will show the world who's really got its back.
Саміт НАТО, саміт Євросоюзу, саміт Великої Сімки.
We are waiting for meaningful steps from NATO, the EU and the G7. We know that the Russians have already begun to lobby their interests. These are the interests of war. We know that they are working with some partners. We know that they want to put this issue out, the struggle against war. But this is the war that needs to be put out. Our firm position will be represented at these three summits. At these three summits, we will see who is a friend, who is a partner, and who betrayed us for money. Life can only be defended when united. Freedom must be armed.
Ukraine gained independence in 1991 after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Since then, it's become closer to the West and has never hidden its desire to join NATO. Russian President Vladimir Putin sees the military alliance as a threat and has repeatedly made it clear Kiev should be blocked from joining. Let's take a closer look at the alliance that Russia fears. NATO was founded on April 4th, 1949, after 10 Western European countries, along with the US and Canada, signed the North Atlantic Treaty in Washington. The alliance's primary aim was to counter Soviet influence in Europe after the Second World War. Now, Article 5 of the treaty states that an attack on one member is an attack on all of its members. That article has only been implemented once, in the case of the war in Afghanistan following the 9/11 attacks. Today, NATO consists of 30 states, with North Macedonia becoming the latest member to join the alliance in 2020. Western nations have so far been pretty united in their response against Moscow since it attacked Ukraine 1 month ago. A raft of sanctions has hurt the Russian economy, but it's also created turmoil in global markets, not to mention a dramatic rise in fuel prices. U.S. President Joe Biden has pushed for more sanctions, but German Chancellor Olaf Scholz has said these kinds of measures, while welcome, should not hurt European states more than Russia's leadership.
The truth is that the sanctions that have now been decided on are already hitting many citizens hard, and by no means only at the petrol pump. Sanctions must not hit the European states harder than the Russian leadership. That is our principle.
Now, Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky has been calling for more help from NATO. And as he addressed the military alliance via video link, he said no one should ever underestimate his military again.
Never again. Please, never tell us that our army does not meet NATO standards. We have shown what our standards are capable of and how much we can give to common security in Europe and the world.
Well, joining me now to discuss NATO's position as the Ukraine conflict enters its second month are from Washington, William Courtney. He's a former U.S. ambassador to Georgia and Kazakhstan and now a senior fellow at the Rand Corporation. From London, we have Anna Matveeva, visiting senior research fellow at King's College and the author of Through Times of Trouble, Conflict in Southeastern Ukraine Explained from Within. And in Northamptonshire, UK, Keir Giles, a senior consulting fellow of the Russia and Eurasia program at Chatham House and the author of Moscow Rules, What Drives Russia to Confront the West. Thanks all so much for being with us. If you don't mind, I'd like to actually start with President Zelensky's address to NATO just a few hours ago. He not surprisingly pressed for more military support, but interestingly, didn't ask for a no-fly zone. William Courtney, in so many speeches before, he has repeated and repeated the dire need for that no-fly zone to save lives and potentially end the war. Why do you think he's changed tact now in this NATO address?
Two reasons. It's fairly clear that President Biden, the leaders of other NATO countries, are opposed to that because of the risk that there could be direct military engagement between NATO forces and Russian forces. And second, experts have argued that actually no-fly zone is not the most effective, most important step. Having better ground-to-air missiles to take out aircraft, drones, helicopters are more important.
Right, so he has pressed NATO for more support. Do you think that is really the best strategy here?
Yes, and it's a consistent strategy. He's used in addressing the U.S. Congress, parliaments in Europe, and in fact, it is a strategy that makes a lot of sense. So we see all the allies stepping up their support, in some cases reversing policies, such as Germany's reversal of its longstanding policy not to ship lethal weapons into a combat zone. So it has been an effective strategy, especially because the Ukrainians have been so courageous and effective in using the weapons that the West has already provided.
Right. Keir, let me turn to you. You know, the argument from the other side is that NATO has actually been more the source of, rather than the solution to, this conflict. What do you think? Has NATO just kind of provoked the bear, or is it actually helping Ukraine and all of us, as Ukraine argues, fight for peace?
Well, certainly Russia would like us to think that this is all the fault of NATO. They point to countries next to Russia joining NATO as part of the trigger for this whole crisis. But we have a whole 30 years of case studies to show that that's not actually the case. Russia doesn't need the excuse of NATO being anywhere nearby to invade its neighbors and to attack countries around it. And if you look at the case study of the Baltic states, it shows that NATO is actually a force for stability and a force for peace. Russia also fundamentally misunderstands the nature of NATO and why people actually want to join it in the first place. President Putin, before this crisis started, was talking about NATO making dangerous attempts to seize Ukrainian territory. He thinks it's like the old Warsaw Pact that grabbed countries into itself, as opposed to countries clamoring, begging to actually join NATO precisely because of Russia's behavior. Saying that it's NATO's fault is confusing cause with effect.
Keir, explain a little more about your position, though, because you say the West is actually helping Russia, whether Russia realizes it or not right now, by eventually bringing potentially the end to a dictatorship. Russia, of course, does not see that as the case, and some argue that the West, in all of its attempts in the past to try to bring an end to dictatorships, has ended quite badly. Why do you think it would be different this time?
I think you might possibly be referring to something I wrote a few weeks ago, saying that a military defeat would be the best thing that's happened to Russia this century. The problem for Russia is that it is an imperial power that hasn't come to terms with the end of empire. It still thinks that it has the right to control countries beyond its borders, to have this buffer zone, this sphere of influence, where those countries don't have a right to determine their own future, their own security and defensive policy, including joining NATO. Now, the one thing that's been consistently successful in changing the trajectory of former imperial powers and letting them come to terms with the fact that they are in a new world where the age of empires is over is actually suffering a military defeat that sets the limits of their ambition. Britain's been through this with Suez in 1956. Algeria in 1962 was the French experience. The difference with Russia is they have not yet had that experience. All of their attempts to push their power back, to reconquer the former dominions, have actually been successful up until now. Georgia, the war in Ukraine, they haven't received that severe military setback that would actually set the limits of their power.
And NATO is the key now to setting those limits.
Well, unfortunately not, because NATO has said very clearly that it is staying out of this conflict. NATO has said it is not going to be involved, and in doing so before the invasion actually began, gave a green light to President Putin to move in, confident that he would not be risking that escalation with the entirety of the West that he was so concerned about. So everything that NATO is doing now is working from that default position of not assisting Ukraine and trying to find ways to actually provide means to Ukraine of bolstering its resilience, of holding out as long as possible, while still not taking that escalatory step, as it would now be, of actually getting directly involved. There was a time when no-fly zones would have helped, and that was the time when we were calling for them 3 weeks before the actual invasion. It might have been possible to impose them and possibly even to deter Russia from invading at all. But the moment the war started, NATO getting involved would be a direct escalation and a direct challenge to Russia, and that is exactly what NATO is trying to avoid.
Okay. Let me get Anna into the conversation. And because of your area of specialization, do comment on what you think the future is now in this conflict of specifically Donetsk and Luhansk, where Russia feels that, as Keir would describe it, that, imperial partnership in a way with those areas in particular, being majority Russian-speaking and ethnic Russian. What happens to those areas in particular going forward as NATO increases its military support for Ukraine's military?
Well, I would suggest that we should look at the actual fighting there. Because that's the most ferocious war theater, while all the operations have been kind of concentrated in Luhansk and Donetsk in terms of actual infantry assault. And this is where the Russian army has been slowly and at a great loss actually taking ground, while the media attention, understandably, is very much centered over Mariupol, which has been disastrous attacks on civilian targets, and of course Kiev, the capital of Ukraine. So in that sense, we need to really look at the military situation in the so-called unrecognized entities, and their advance further towards Kharkiv, from the southeast towards the north, and whether they will be able to join with the Russian forces advancing from Kharkiv and then further down. If that would be successful, and that's obviously where the Russian military effort is concentrating now, that would mean that the significant part of in Ukraine, of that part of Ukraine, would be either bogged down in atrocious fighting for a long time, with both sides being there kind of digging in for all-out war, or we're going to see, which I think more likely would be kind of repositioning, and then we need to really give the peace a chance. I think peace is still a viable option.
Okay. William Courtney, if you don't mind, I'd like to move kind of back toward the larger geopolitical issues here, and NATO in particular, and ask specifically about China's potential role here. I mean, NATO is saying Beijing needs to meet its responsibilities. I'm quoting NATO, responsibilities over this conflict. I mean, how important is China here? Do you think it could be a game changer if Beijing, for example, throws more support, even if just economic, behind Moscow?
It could be a game changer, but it is not a game changer thus far. China in the UN Security Council debate, remember, did not support Russia. It abstained on a Russian resolution. Several times, the Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi has expressed support for sovereignty and independence of countries, including, he said once, Ukraine. So while Chinese propaganda and disinformation is spreading themes that Russia likes, in actuality, it really hasn't done a whole lot. After Russia invaded Ukraine the first time in 2014, the Russians thought Chinese would give them a lot of support. As it turned out, the Chinese drove harder bargains with Russian companies in gas and other areas, and so the Russians ended up being disappointed. Thus far, it doesn't look like China is going to come to Russia's aid in any substantial way.
even with its, thoughts that it might want Russian backing for any efforts it might make in the future to take Taiwan?
Yes, and Russian backing would not count for much anyway because Russia's prestige internationally is so low.
Okay. Keir, let me come to you with another angle on all this. There's been a lot of push by many in the West for even harsher sanctions on Russia. But we actually just heard OPEC officials express some pretty serious concerns over that proposed EU ban on Russian oil. I mean, if they can't find, for example, solidarity behind oil sanctioning, does Russia stand to gain some more ground and become even stronger if moves on that type of sanctioning aren't taken?
Well, Russia may not necessarily get stronger, but certainly a failure to cut Europe's ties on Russian energy will certainly mitigate all of the impact of the other sanctions that have taken place so far. Let's not forget a big part of the impact of the sanctions on Russia was freezing assets overseas, was freezing those central bank assets so that Russia couldn't use its foreign currency reserves. But for as long as Europe keeps on buying Russian oil and gas, those foreign currency reserves are going to be constantly replenished. And that, of course, will dilute the effect of all of the other sanctions. It's not just OPEC that is concerned about the impact of Europe weaning itself off this self-imposed dependency on Russia. It's actually European politicians as well that are balking at the economic cost and the economic pain on their own citizens that would actually be involved in taking sanctions against Russia seriously. Now, this was a fairly predictable step, that initial flush of enthusiasm for bearing the harsh economic costs of actually constraining Russia and punishing Russia for its actions was always going to wear off quite quickly. The problem is whether it is actually sustainable for long enough that it actually influences Russian decision-making.
Anna, what do you make of that? Do you think the economic pressure is sustainable? Because it's unprecedented. I mean, the moves we've seen by individual companies, the public pressure on even individual companies working in Russia, from McDonald's to Disney to everybody. People really believe this time they can make a difference. And I've heard Americans say they're actually willing to pay more for gas and oil to know that America is doing the right thing in this case. Do you think it's even making a dent in Russia's stance on Ukraine, though, and the pressure that it's putting on the Kremlin?
Yeah, I think that is actually wishful thinking, and I think that it is producing an absolutely opposite effect. I have, unlike I think many of your guests, actually worked in Syria, and I lived under sanctions. I used to work for the United Nations. So we, like everybody else, were sharing the burden of it. It is not fun, but it does not mean that Syria has been brought down to its knees to the extent that it changed behavior. And sanctions on Syria affected its economy more than it actually can affect Russia, because it still has oil and gas and produces lots of food, and it's a large country. So what it actually makes it more kind of people more believing into the government narrative that the West not only doesn't like us, but actively means us harm. So every possible failure of own policy can be now attributed to sanctions. So yes, in terms of strengthening Russian official discourse, sanctions are making it dig in the field and look more plausible than it looked before. So yes, and I think that the effect of punishing Russia is there, but the effect of changing policy course, not at all.
Okay, William, Courtney, I'd like to get your perspective on that, because America is one of the countries, of course, in the lead on sanctioning Russia here.
So sanctions by themselves can have a dramatic impact. They do not always cause change in behavior, but they do raise the price of misbehavior. In the case of Russia now, though, we need to look at several factors. One is the frustrations on the battlefield. This is going to have an adverse impact on the reputation of the Kremlin and Moscow. The pariah-like status that Russia now has in Europe is going to be disappointing to a lot of Russians. We're seeing more and more popular unrest, and we also think we're seeing some elite infighting, including some top-level people such as Anatoly Chubais, who was close to Putin, has now left the country and opposed the war. So it will be the combination of all these factors that may have an impact on whether, for example, there is regime change in Russia. Over the last 30 years of Russia's modern independence, probably the Kremlin's position has not been weaker at any time than it is now.
Anna, very quickly, why do you disagree there? I saw you shake your head.
Yeah, because I think the sanctions alienate exactly those people from whom the change comes from. Middle class, younger professionals, they're taking the brunt and they are the most vulnerable. And they will be now alienated both by the West and by the aging Russian leadership. So, yes, I think the sanctions are killing every constituency that it actually has where change can come from.
Keir, your thoughts quickly on that as an observer?
Let's not overestimate the scope for any sector of the Russian population to actually bring about change. Now, this is a moment that President Putin has been preparing for in so many ways over the last 20 years, but not only building up Russia's power in military and economic terms to launch a war, but also for cracking down on his own population. We've seen the screws being tightened gradually over the last 5 years and repression of ordinary Russian citizens increasing to the point where it's much harder for them to actually come out on the streets and protest. And Russia is ready for mass protest, mass discontent, mass calls for change. That is why they have set up the Rosgvardia, the National Guard, equipped for inflicting mass casualties on its own population if they dare to come out and protest. So the scope for individual Russians actually organizing to bring about political change from within is strictly limited. The influence on Russia's behavior has to come through other ways.
Keir, let me address this with you, though, because one of the major problems here is the fear that under increasing pressure, Russia just may attack even harder. And NATO is actually now trying to provide Ukraine with some protection against what could be biological, chemical, or nuclear attacks to come. That is an extremely frightening prospect.
Well, there are two very distinct areas there. For chemical weapons, it's surprising that Russia has not yet used them, because it is a standard part of this Russian tactic of triggering humanitarian disasters and causing the maximum civilian suffering in order to put pressure on the victim government, on President Zelensky in this case, both directly in order to end the suffering of his people and indirectly because Western leaders will be pressuring him to make concessions to end the fighting. So chemical weapons would be a normal part of that. And it looks as though it may have been a success for the US policy of disclosing information, disclosing intelligence in advance about what Russia was planning to do that has headed off those plans. Nuclear weapons, however, are an entirely different category of Russian escalation. And people get very excited every time President Putin makes nuclear threats, largely because they've forgotten that he does it very regularly. This is an absolutely standard part of the Russian diplomatic discourse, the rhetoric that comes from President Putin, and it's part of trying to set boundaries for the conflict, trying to make sure that nobody else gets involved and Russia can pursue its own policies without being interfered with. And it has to be said, that's been very successful because the West is acquiescing in the boundaries that Russia is setting.
Okay. Anna, let me put that to you then. I mean, you know, only Russia describes the breakup of the Soviet Union as the greatest political catastrophe of the 20th century. So there is legitimate reason to believe that Moscow, you know, has eyes on correcting what it sees as this mistake. But how far will they go? I mean, is NATO right to be preparing for this biological, chemical, nuclear attack? I mean, is NATO actually postponing the inevitable by kind of not taking action now?
I think that their plans, whatever they have been limited to Ukraine. I also don't think that they are determined, unless we are thinking that it is the whole world is complete kind of lunacy. Yeah, if we think still that it's rational, the plans would have been for the eastern part of Ukraine and kind of transforming Ukraine into more, not only neutral, but more kind of Russia-facing country. I don't think we're looking at territorial contacts. I think that it is really absolutely acceptable that the Baltic states are gone, that Moldova is gone, it has a neutral status. Even we do not hear that much about Georgia. I would say that now this is the last breath of the empire. This is where its last agony, and I think it will be over pretty soon, and we should really be stop talking about some kind of apocalyptic scenario. We have seen where the Russian army is now, And I think that we really need to see how we draw this page to a close. And as Keir said, that yes, look into future and look at to how things would be rebuilt.
Okay, and I'm glad to hear that you at least think that Putin will play out as a somewhat rational actor. William, Courtney, do you have the same faith that this will wrap up soon? Russia will, in essence, learn a lesson, and this can stop?
Russia in the past has often been cautious when met with determination and strength on the part of adversaries. For example, in the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis, Premier Khrushchev withdrew nuclear weapons rather than risk a war. In 1973, in the Yom Kippur War, the U.S. raised the nuclear alert level, and Soviets did not challenge that. So I think the Russians would be very careful about going nuclear because they know the U.S. has such a strong nuclear capability that they could not count on escaping without being hit in return.
Okay, William, Courtney, I will have to give you the final word. Unfortunately, we're out of time for this edition of The Newsmakers. I'd like to thank all three of you so much for being with us, and our viewers, of course, for tuning in as well. Remember to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey, and we'll see you next time.